So our next speaker is Ramsha Jahangir, Ramsha is a Pakistani award-winning journalist specializing in technology and human rights, and she is currently pursuing her master's degree in journalism, media, and globalization as an Erasmus Mundus scholar. Over to you, Ramsha.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. So my talk is going to be less technical because I don't come from a technical background, but I will try to make it interesting and relevant as much as possible. So what I'm talking about is content regulation in the digital age, because this is a developing, this is an increasing trend globally, but most particularly in the part of the world I come from, which is South Asia. So I'll be keeping the focus on South Asia, and keeping it very specific about the rules and the regulation framework and the relationship with tech platforms the governments have at the moment. But then this trend applies globally as well. And some of the things about internet freedoms we can talk about towards the end of the talk. So these are some headlines to give you some introductory context to what's happening. In India at the moment, there is a whole battle going on between the government and the tech firms. So for instance, India has issued final warning to Twitter to comply with their social media regulation. And then WhatsApp has also sued India for over privacy concerns in their new social media regulations. We will talk about that more specifically later. In Pakistan, we have had a lot of bans on social media platforms, but we're also going for similar social media guidelines that require companies to conform and comply. And if they don't, then they have to face with severe consequences. Similarly, in Turkey, there are a set of sweeping rules that again guide how social media companies should regulate content and monitor, and at the same time take down critical content, which is problematic, of course. So what do governments want? In brief, it's the most prominent requirements in the social media guidelines they've come up with around the world is one of them.
Olá, pessoal, bom dia, tudo bem com vocês?
Sorry. Okay, so yeah, the platforms have to take down content that the government specifies as problematic within a stipulated time frame. So in some countries, they have 24 hours to respond. In other countries, they have 36 hours to respond. And so this, of course, puts added pressure on social media platforms to regulate, monitor, and take down content. And of course, social media platforms have a proper way of how they moderate content. They have their own community standards and community guidelines, platform violation rules. But this adds like sort of an added layer of censorship, because the governments want you, even if they don't violate your community standards, they still want you to take it down because they think so. The other most prominent requirement is localization of data. So they want to establish local database servers and record and store decrypted data within the country. So in Pakistan, for instance, one of the requirements is that if law enforcement agencies require, then they should be given access to data in decrypted format. And again, this is problematic because it has concerns for press freedom and privacy. And yeah, digital rights overall. Then another thing they want is, because they want this to become a permanent settlement of content moderation, so they want like platforms to appoint local spokespersons or compliance officers who they should be available 24 hours for the law enforcement agency. So they want like direct access and establish a communication channel with platforms so that they can entertain their takedown requests. But so these are some of the requirements mentioned in the new social media guidelines. But what are governments doing to ensure that tech platforms comply? So recently, after Twitter labeled some of the government officials' tweets as manipulated media, Police in India raided Twitter offices as part of their investigation. So of course, this is very intimidating, and at the same time, it's a way of pushing for compliance. Then at the same time, Indian government has told Twitter, which is very recent, I think it was last week only, that they will face unintended consequences if they fail to comply with the country's new social media rules, which have the provisions that I just talked about. In Pakistan, we have a history of banning apps. We are very fond of banning them. So we have a history of YouTube being banned for a couple of years. And then last year and to date, there exists a sweeping ban on all dating applications, including Tinder and Grindr. And the reason the authorities have given is that it's spreading immoral content. But immoral content, they have not defined or specified what do they describe immoral content as. Then at the same time, TikTok was banned, then they revoked the ban, then they banned TikTok again, and it's become a cycle now with TikTok. And they said that we are banning them because TikTok is not complying with our requests to filter any obscene content. Again, they did not specify or describe what obscene content is in this regard, but the point is to crack down, and this push for compliance, that these methods for announcing, for banning platforms, and also, for instance, raiding Twitter offices or threatening them with legal notices is a method or a tactic to get them to listen or address these concerns. But tech firms to date have resisted in whatever way they can. Of course, tech firms, the biggest thing is that local law is very important in this context. For instance, Facebook and Twitter have this requirement that if something is illegal in your local country, they can remove it. But on top of that, the governments want additional measures of censorship. So WhatsApp recently filed a legal complaint against Indian government seeking to block regulations coming into force because they said that these new rules are a violation of privacy rights. It's also very ironic that WhatsApp, of all the platforms, is talking about privacy rights, but this is what it's come down to. And they want social media company, because the rules require the social media companies to identify the first originator of information when authorities demand it. So like I said, they also want access to information in decrypted format, and WhatsApp is end-to-end encrypted. So of course, this is not a possibility, and this is why this is a concern. And there's currently a case ongoing between WhatsApp and the Indian government. In Pakistan, tech firms have threatened to leave its 70 million internet users because they said these rules in their current format make it extremely difficult for AIC, which is a coalition of technology companies, to make their services available to Pakistani users and businesses. So and right now in Pakistan as well, the rules have been approved, but again, the consultation and the conversation is still happening. And given India's example, we don't see the future to be very bright. A little context to what's happening in Pakistan, going back to give you how regulation in our part of the world is also very ignored and why it's becoming such a pressing problem, is we already have a very, very tight cybercrime law. And the cybercrime law has very, very vague provisions. For instance, it requires companies to remove or block content which is against or in the interest of the glory of Islam, integrity or security or defense of Pakistan, and morality, decency, public order, very, very broad, vague terminology. And this has been, the application of the law has been used in the past to crack down on journalists, critical activists, women, and minority groups and political speech, basically. So already the environment was very, very restricted. And then on top of that, there come the rules. Now, why were the rules introduced? So under this existing cybercrime law, there is a provision that requires lawmakers to come up with a rule, making the whole regulation a transparent process and sort of an effective oversight mechanism for the content removal and blocking. But Unfortunately, what they did, they introduced added measures and created new offenses and additional powers, gave additional powers to the regulator, and just made it completely opposite to what the legal requirement was. So instead of making it more transparent, they made it more strict and added more provisions and categories to the existing law. Some of the new categories are defamation and criticism of the government or government officials. Another thing that they've added, and which is very problematic, is fake news. And they've described it as fake or false information that threatens the public order, public health, and public safety. And of course, the question of who decides what fake news is, how do they fact-checking measures, and yeah, of course, that's another discussion, but they've also introduced this, which was not there in the previous cybercrime law. Again, data localization is something I've already spoken about. What they've pushed for is establishing their local data center, and they want it to be information, including subscriber information, traffic data, content data, and any other information or data they want access to. And social media companies, of course, do not agree with this provision, and they've said that this will harm local businesses. It's also very expensive, and because Pakistan at the moment does not even have a data protection law, so this is, of course, not very feasible at this moment. To conclude, to finish up on the last part of what are tech platforms doing. So tech platforms are also doing, getting into the regulation framework and playing a part. We all know that tech platforms banned Donald Trump from platforms. So they've introduced deplatforming people as an increased measure. They've also started labeling the accounts of state-controlled news organizations and accounts and officials in some parts of the world, and in some part of the world it's completely ignored, which in my case is Pakistan. They're also labeling misinformation and potential harm. Then there is the debate that do tech platforms, yes, they partner with fact-checking, third-party fact-checking organizations, but then again, should tech platforms even have the right or the authority to decide what is visible, what they label, what they not, because of course, at the end of the day, it can become a political decision. Some of them have introduced a ban on political ads. And like Facebook has introduced an external review board, which is the Facebook's oversight board, which is again being debated. What is it even useful? But what's happening is that for Facebook, for instance, the recent ruling, it's exposed flaws in Facebook's own implementation of their moderation policies. So it gives an external review of their actions. But again, to what extent would they actually be able to contribute is another debate, and to think of how internet freedoms will be governed in the future to come. So that's pretty much it from my side. I was hoping to have more of a discussion towards the end, because these are very, very open topics and concerns that apply to most of us. And if there are any thoughts, comments, or questions, I am happy to address.